4 years, people have called Chaos Galaxy a dead game.
Quite frankly, the Chaos Galaxy has a lot of faults.
Zach, freaking hate you.
Because a lot of people recently, they've been complaining about the Chaos Galaxy ban list, and they're worried about the state of the game, the future of the game.
April 2020 was the biggest Chaos Galaxy tournament, amassing 64 players. However, by September 2023, we had a 5-player tournament. To figure out why this happened, we need to understand what made Chaos Galaxy so popular and gave us moments like this.
This game is sick! Like, this game is so sick.
When Chaos Galaxy was first officially released in January 2017, it was a super fun casual game that took on a style of old Yu-Gi-Oh! And merged it with unique mechanics such as planets, stars, and zones. These mechanics made the game feel unique and simple. In other games you might get overwhelmed by all the choices you can make, but planets make deck building streamlined, encouraging you to play as many creatures as possible from the same planet. Zones limit the number of creatures you can have at a time, and stars keep players from making too many actions in the one turn. These mechanics make the game feel like an interactive back and forth game, rather than sitting there and watching your opponent play with their cards while you wait to do the same with yours. A community Discord server was created for dedicated fans to come together and discuss the game they love. At the time, server life was overwhelmingly positive. Most players were just playing for fun, with very little knowledge about the true meta. Rather than trying to build the best deck, players would build the best type of deck. Rather than building the best deck in the meta, they would build the best Galafaction deck or the best Night Jungle deck. During these times, players were hosting small tournaments, but these tournaments wouldn't last for long. Something big was coming. Galaxy Madness was the first Chaos Galaxy tournament sponsored by Zach. 89 players signed up, with 64 final players. Most of Zach's viewers at the time were unaware that there was a way to play Chaos Galaxy for free online, so once this tournament was announced, many of them jumped at the opportunity to play. The tournament was a huge success. Games were streamed and commentated by Shulktime and Aaron Dre, some of the original players. These streams were viewed by hundreds and became a focal point of the community. Players would be typing in chat as they watched their favourite competitors play their favourite decks. After the game, the hype moved over to the Discord where players continued these discussions. Since the game was so new and fresh, players didn't know that certain cards were broken or certain decks were busted. If we went back to play that format with our new knowledge, there would only be about 1 or 2 competitive decks, and 50% of these cards would be staples. A few months passed after the big tournament, and server life was great. However, the meta took a bit of a shift. People started to discover that cards such as Slush Infestation and Dark Space Eater, as well as other miscellaneous staples, were extremely strong, with many of these cards later being banned or limited. This obviously took its toll on the fun of the format, since if you wanted to succeed you needed to play these cards, and thus you had less deck building freedom. Despite this, with the release of Set 4 on the horizon, most of the momentum from Galaxy Madness carried through. There was a second 64-player tournament to celebrate the release of Set 4, followed by a 32-player tournament not too long after. There have now been a total of 160 players over the past year in 3 tournaments alone. Surely some of them would stick around. It had now been 2 years and the meta remained more or less the same. It was clear that Sindel was the only competitively viable planet. Although players tried to build other decks, they just couldn't keep up with Sindel Control or Sindel Tempo. If players wanted to have success, they could only play one planet, and players began getting tired of this, and thus, they left. The only reason why the players made it this far was because players were slow at developing the meta. Sindel was easily the best deck since Set 3, and yet it was only really Set 4 when it rose to popularity. It could have been an entire 2 more years of Sindel dominance. Only true fans remained after this. These players stuck with the game despite how bad it was. This was mainly because the game was skillful, so there was an incentive to grind. The players that remained were taught useful fundamentals that would go on to help them in the future. While they waited for a spark to reignite the community, they began to play in KO Cups. These were small, week-long tournaments to just play some competitive Chaos Galaxy. After what felt like months of waiting, playing the same decks over and over, the community finally found its spark. Zach shouted out another tournament, but this time it was a competitive tournament. This would be the last competitive tournament of the format, as Zach began to tease a new product, Planetary Collections. After the top 5 decks all being Sindel in the previous tournament, it became clear that the community desperately needed new cards. Ideally, once these cards release, there would be 3 viable planets rather than 1. Another thing the community needed was a ban list. It was becoming clear that some cards were stronger than others, and changes needed to be made. The community could only be growing from this point. Zach seemed to be catering more towards the competitive community. He just shouted out a competitive tournament. He was releasing strong alternatives to Sindel, and he had his eyes on the ban list. But then, it happened. The Planetary Collections were released and the reception was great. For about 2 weeks there were 7 or 8 viable decks and the format remained skillful. But then, we got the ban list. Now, don't get me wrong, players wanted a ban list, but some of these changes were just so unnecessary. Sindel was no longer the best planet in the format, and Sindel control wasn't even the best way to play Sindel, and yet, Gehenna got limited. And everyone knows limiting a combiner is the same as banning a combiner, and thus, a healthy tier 2 deck died. Then Temple Traps got limited, thus killing another healthy tier 2 deck. But this wasn't even the worst part. For some reason Warp-Core Jetpack got unlimited, and that was the final blow. Warp-Core Jetpack is best used in Polysium. The best counter to Warp-Core Jetpack is also in Polysium. Removal is strong against Polysium. 3 removal cards just got limited. All this resulted in Polysium being the only viable deck for 6 months. The format got so bad that players began a gentleman's agreement not to play Polysium in tournaments. The format got so bad that players began to make a custom ban list. A new ban list was released, fixing many of the mistakes from the previous format. This ban list ended up being what the 2-week mini format should have been. Many of the decks played in this format were just updated versions of the decks from the mini format. For the past 3 years there was only a 2-week period where the format was enjoyable to play, so only the most loyal players remained. With players finally having a fun format, maybe the game could thrive again. All that was needed was another big influx of players. With Set 5 sneak peeks being revealed, the people left were having a great time. They had a fun format and saw a promising future. Set 5 finally dropped, bringing with it the biggest format change since Set 3. Months into the format, people were still actively playing the game, but they were all the same players each time, so questions began to be asked. Where were the new players? And where was Zach? The current playing group have been active for over 3 years, with thousands of time in-game. This meant formats were developing quicker, and thus they got stale quicker. After 6 months, there was 1 new competitive card. This certainly helped since it added a new deck, but it wasn't enough to carry a 6-month period on its own. 12 months into the format, and questions arose. Where were the new players? And where was Zach? The absence of new players and new formats hinted at deeper issues. With no new players and no new cards or ban lists, we ended up with a 5-player tournament. It's clear to me that the Chaos Galaxy online scene needs 2 things to thrive. a fun format, and new players. Early on in Chaos Galaxy's history, there were tournaments that Zach would shout out to get new players, but the format wasn't good enough to keep any around. Now the format is good, but there's no new players. We're already in a good format, but there's still areas to be improved on. Some planets still aren't viable, and small changes like mini card releases and ban lists can help keep formats fresh. On top of this, keeping Fight Club games casual and ranked games competitive help new players to win games. These changes would help keep new players around, but what actually gets them to play in the first place? This is where Galaxy Madness style tournaments come in. Ideally, I want to collaborate with Zach and have 2 casual events a year, called amateur events. In these events, players who have received a top 3 in SBR cannot participate to ensure the newer players are having the success. If this is done in a similar way to Galaxy Madness, 64 players will sign up and play, and the non-players can create content around this such as predictions, coaching, and talk about the rising stars. If implemented correctly, this creates a clear pathway for new players and can hopefully give them early success. So, is Chaos Galaxy dead? No. The game will probably only die when Zach stops making the game, but can the game and community be in a much better spot than it is right now? Yes. This only works if both Zach and us, the community, work towards the same goal. Hopefully having more frequent events for new players, frequent updates to the format, and having separate casual and competitive options can help to grow the community into a bright future.